You can spend $250,000 teaching a machine what to find. Ethan Brooks said that afternoon, shielding his eyes from the glare rolling off the red clay, but eventually the data always tells the truth. Nobody argued with him. At Fort Redstone, a team of EOD specialists had spent nearly 4 hours sweeping a training field with advanced detectors, thermal imaging systems, and enough electronics to fill a small command truck. Every screen looked clean. Every report looked convincing, yet the 3 training devices hidden somewhere inside the search zone remained unfound. Frustration was beginning to replace confidence. Radios crackled, officers checked their watches, deadlines slipped. Beyond the chain-link fence, an 82-year-old veteran named Frank Mercer stood quietly in a faded field jacket, watching the same patch of ground he had been studying since morning. He had not said a word. He did not need to. Something about the field felt wrong. Frank Mercer had arrived before most of the technicians that morning. He had parked his aging pickup beneath a patch of shade near the perimeter road, and wandered toward the fence with a paper cup of coffee in one hand. Nobody paid much attention to him. Why would they? He looked like dozens of other retirees who occasionally visited the base museum or attended public demonstrations. His faded Vietnam-era cap had seen better decades. His field jacket carried the soft creases of long use. The only unusual thing about him was how long he stood in one place. Hour after hour, while specialists crossed the training field with detectors and tablets, Frank remained near the fence studying the landscape. At 82 he moved carefully, but there was nothing slow about his eyes. They drifted across the grass, the soil, the shallow dips in the terrain, and the narrow drainage paths left behind by spring rains. He noticed details most people dismiss: a patch of grass bending differently from the rest, a faint change in soil color, a line of insects that curved around a certain section of ground for reasons nobody seemed interested in asking. Around him, technicians came and went carrying equipment worth more than his truck. The technology was impressive. Frank knew that. He respected it. The world had changed since his younger days, and for the better in many ways. But experience had taught him something technology never could. The land always carried traces of what had happened to it. The challenge was learning how to read them. As another team completed yet another unsuccessful sweep, Frank took a slow sip of cold coffee and returned his attention to the field. The longer he watched, the stronger the feeling became. The answer was out there. It had been out there all day. The problem was not that nobody was looking. The problem was that everybody was looking for the wrong thing. Ethan Brooks was not the kind of man who ignored facts. At 34, he had built his reputation on every certification hanging in his office had been earned through years of study, testing, and relentless attention to detail. The specialists working beside him trusted him because he usually had answers when problems appeared. That was why the situation bothered him more than he was willing to admit. The search should have been over hours ago. Instead, another clean report flashed across his tablet screen, adding to a growing stack of results that all said the same thing: nothing found. Ethan removed his sunglasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Around him, the mood on the field was changing. The easy confidence from earlier that morning had started to fade. Technicians spoke in shorter sentences. Officers exchanged concerned looks near the command tent. Every new sweep consumed time without producing results. Ethan studied the latest map and frowned. The equipment was functioning perfectly. Calibration checks were perfect. Environmental conditions were within acceptable limits. According to every piece of data available, the field should have been clear. Yet Command insisted 3 training devices were still out there. Nearby, a younger technician glanced toward the fence and smirked. That old guy has been staring at the field longer than any of us. A few tired laughs followed. Ethan looked up and noticed Frank Mercer standing in exactly the same spot where he had been hours earlier. The old man seemed completely unconcerned by the frustration spreading across the operation. That calm bothered Ethan more than he cared to admit. Most visitors would have left by now. Frank had not moved. He simply watched. Maybe he already knows where they are, another technician joked. More laughter followed. Ethan allowed himself a faint smile. If he can find what all this equipment missed, he said, tapping the side of his tablet, I will buy him the best steak dinner in Alabama. The joke landed well. The group chuckled and returned to work. But as Ethan looked back toward the fence, he noticed something unusual. Frank was not watching the specialists. He was watching the ground. and somehow that felt different. The afternoon sun hung high above Fort Redstone, turning the air over the field into shimmering waves. Frank Mercer rested both hands on the top rail of the fence and continued watching. He had been doing little else since morning. Most people would have seen an empty training field dotted with specialists carrying expensive equipment. Frank saw something different. He saw patterns. He saw interruptions. He saw questions. A gust of wind rolled across the grass, bending thousands of blades in the same direction, almost all of them. One small section reacted differently. The variation lasted only a second before disappearing. Most people would never have noticed it. Frank did. His eyes drifted farther downrange. A narrow trail of ants crossed the field, carrying tiny pieces of dried vegetation. The line moved steadily until it approached a particular patch of ground. Then the insects separated around it before reconnecting several feet later. Frank narrowed his eyes. Interesting. Nearby, another team completed a sweep. The detector remained silent. The technician moved on. Frank did not. He studied the same area again. The soil color looked slightly different there. Not enough to stand out. Not enough to trigger suspicion. Just different enough to raise a question. Years ago, one of the older engineers who had mentored him had taught him something simple. Machines identify objects. Experienced people identify inconsistencies. The distinction mattered. Frank shifted his weight and looked toward a shallow depression hidden beneath the grass, nearly 50 yards away. Rainwater would have flowed differently there. Roots would have grown differently there. Tiny changes. Easy to dismiss. Easy to miss. Yet after 4 hours of watching, the field had begun telling a story. Not a loud story. Not an obvious one. A quiet one. The kind that only appeared when somebody stopped rushing long enough to listen. Behind him, a gate creaked open. Staff Sergeant Ryan Cole stepped through, carrying paperwork toward the command tent. As he passed the fence, he noticed the old veteran studying the field with unusual focus. Ryan followed Frank's gaze toward the grass and then back to the old man's face. Something about the expression he saw there made him slow his pace. It was not curiosity. It was recognition. Ryan Cole had learned to trust instincts he could not always explain. 2 deployments and more training exercises than he cared to count had taught him that experience often announced itself quietly. It was rarely the loudest person in the room. As he stood near the fence, he watched Frank Mercer continue studying the field and felt an unexpected memory surface. For a moment, the heat of Alabama seemed to fade. In its place came another landscape from another lifetime. Frank had once been a young combat engineer, standing beside a narrow jungle trail thousands of miles from home. The air had been thick with humidity. Rainwater dripped from broad leaves overhead. Beside him stood Sergeant Walter Grady, a man with gray beginning to creep into his hair and a habit of teaching lessons without announcing them. Grady had stopped on a trail one afternoon and spent nearly 20 minutes staring at a patch of ground. Not talking, not moving, just watching. Young Frank had finally asked what he was looking for. The older man smiled and pointed toward the earth. "Nothing," he said. "That is the problem." Frank had not understood. Grady then explained that sometimes the most important clue was the absence of something that should have been there. A broken pattern, a missing detail, a silence where activity belonged. The lesson stayed with Frank long after that day ended. Years later, he still remembered the patience in Grady's voice, and the way the older engineer treated observation like a skill worth protecting. Not because it made someone smarter, because it kept people from becoming careless. The memory lingered for only a moment before the present returned. The fence, the field, the technicians, the heat. Frank blinked and looked back across the grass. The same feeling remained. Something out there did not fit, not because it was obvious, but because it disrupted the natural rhythm of the landscape. Ryan watched the old veteran closely. There was no guesswork in his expression, no performance. Just quiet concentration built from decades of paying attention. Across the field, another detector completed another sweep and reported nothing unusual. Frank listened to the distant radio call, then slowly shook his head. He had heard the answer. He simply did not believe the question was being asked correctly. Ryan remained near the fence long after he should have returned to the command tent. The paperwork in his hand had become an excuse. His real attention stayed fixed on Frank Mercer. There was something familiar about the old veteran's patience. Not the patience of a man waiting for something to happen, but the patience of someone allowing a problem to reveal itself. Around them, the search continued. Specialists crossed the field in carefully planned patterns. Tablets displayed maps. Radios carried updates. The technology was impressive, yet the mood was steadily deteriorating. 4 hours of effort had produced nothing. Ryan watched Frank study the same sections of ground again and again. Eventually, curiosity got the better of him. "You see something out there?" he asked. Frank did not answer immediately. His eyes remained on the field. "I see a few places people stopped questioning," he finally said. Ryan glanced across the grass. "You worked with this kind of thing?" A faint smile touched the old man's face, a long time ago. The answer was simple, but Ryan sensed there was far more behind it. Before he could ask another question, laughter drifted from a group of technicians near the command tent. The sound carried easily across the open field. Frank did not react. Ryan looked toward the specialists and then back toward the old veteran. Most people would have felt uncomfortable standing alone while becoming the subject of jokes. Frank seemed completely unaffected. Years had taught him the difference between being underestimated and being threatened. Across the field, Ethan Brooks received another status update. The result was the same as every report before it. Nothing found. He thanked the technician, glanced toward the fence, and noticed Ryan speaking with the old man. Something about the scene caught his attention. The staff sergeant was not the type to waste time on random conversations during an active exercise. Ethan watched for another moment, before slipping his tablet under one arm and heading toward Ryan. Saw him coming first. Frank noticed a few seconds later. Neither man said anything. The afternoon was slowly changing direction, even if nobody else realized it yet. Ethan Brooks stopped a few feet from the fence and looked from Ryan to the old veteran. Up close, Frank Mercer appeared completely ordinary. There were no medals on display, no introduction, no reason to believe he knew anything about the exercise unfolding behind them. Yet the calm in his eyes felt strangely out of place against the frustration spreading across the field. "Ryan tells me you have been studying the search area all afternoon," Ethan said. Frank nodded once. "I have." Ethan glanced toward the field. "And now you think we missed something?" "I think you missed 3 things. The answer was delivered so matter-of-factly that Ryan almost smiled. Ethan did not. He folded his arms and studied the old man more carefully. Around them, several technicians had begun paying attention. Word traveled quickly when a stranger challenged a team that had spent hours working a problem. "You have not seen the scans," Ethan said. "You do not have the mapping data. You have not been inside the search zone." Frank looked back toward the grass. "No, I have only been watching." A few nearby technicians exchanged amused looks. Ethan exhaled slowly. Under different circumstances, he might have walked away. But the exercise was behind schedule, command was asking questions, and every official method had produced the same disappointing result. "All right," he said. "Let us assume for a moment that you are right. What exactly are you asking for?" Frank pushed away from the fence. 30 seconds. Several technicians laughed. Ethan glanced at them before returning his attention to the old veteran. 30 seconds. Frank nodded. "That is all." Ryan remained silent. He could feel the mood shifting. The laughter sounded less confident than before. Ethan removed his sunglasses and looked out across the field. Then he looked back at Frank. "Fine," he said at last. "You get 30 seconds." The old veteran gave a small nod and started toward the gate. He did not look excited. He did not look nervous. He looked like a man continuing a conversation he had already been having with the ground for the past 4 hours. The field grew quiet as Frank Mercer stepped through the gate. Conversations faded one by one. Even the technicians, who had been smiling a few moments earlier, seemed curious now. Ethan checked his watch. 30 seconds, that was the agreement. No detectors, no scanners, no tablets. Just an old veteran and a search zone that had frustrated trained specialists for most of the day. Frank walked slowly into the field, but there was nothing uncertain about his pace. He had already spent 4 hours studying the terrain from the fence. What happened next had not begun when he stepped through the gate. It had begun the moment he arrived that morning. A warm breeze rolled across the grass. Heat shimmered above the red clay. Somewhere in the distance, a helicopter crossed the sky with a low, steady hum. Frank stopped and looked across the field. His eyes moved from one area to another, following details nobody else seemed interested in. The slight depression he had noticed earlier. The interrupted insect trail. The patch of grass that reacted differently to the wind. Pieces of a puzzle he had been assembling all afternoon. He walked 20 feet to his left and lowered himself onto one knee, The crowd watched in silence. Frank pressed 2 fingers lightly against the soil. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. Then he pointed. First location. A technician immediately marked the spot. Frank stood and continued across the field. Several specialists exchanged uncertain looks. Nobody laughed now. He stopped near another section of grass and repeated the process. 2 fingers against the earth. A brief pause, a quiet nod. Second location. The atmosphere shifted again. Ethan could feel it. Confidence was giving way to curiosity. Frank moved one final time, stopping beside a shallow irregularity in the terrain that most people would have walked past without a second thought. He crouched, touched the ground, and looked up. Third location, then he stood. Nothing dramatic, nothing theatrical, just 3 calm observations delivered by a man who had spent a lifetime paying attention. Verification teams moved out immediately. Radios crackled, seconds stretched. Then the first confirmation came through. A second followed, then a third. Every location was correct. Frank did not smile. He simply looked across the field and slipped his hands back into his jacket pockets. The result was impressive. The quiet confidence behind it was unforgettable. For several long moments, nobody spoke. The radios had delivered their verdict. The verification teams had confirmed every location. The field that had resisted hours of technology had yielded its answers to a man who had spent most of the day standing quietly behind a fence. Ethan Brooks stared at the markers scattered across the grass and felt a familiar certainty disappear. Not because the equipment had failed. It had not. The detectors had worked exactly as designed. What unsettled him was realizing that information and understanding were not always the same thing. Around him, technicians exchanged glances filled with equal parts admiration and disbelief. Ryan Cole watched Frank Mercer closely. There was no satisfaction in the old veteran's expression, no trace of victory. He looked exactly as he had that morning, calm, patient, almost detached from the attention gathering around him. Ethan finally walked over. "How did you know?" The question carried none of the confidence from earlier, only genuine curiosity. Frank looked out across the field where the late afternoon breeze moved through the grass in slow waves. "I did not know," he said quietly. "I suspected." Ethan frowned. Frank continued. "I spent 4 hours watching. The equipment searched for objects. I watched for inconsistencies, different approaches. Same goal." The answer hung in the warm air. Ethan remembered the joke about buying the old man a steak dinner. Suddenly, it did not feel nearly as funny as it had a few hours earlier. The realization brought an unexpected sting of embarrassment. He had spent an entire afternoon questioning data and never once considered asking the old veteran his name. Frank seemed to understand the thought without hearing it. "You built good systems," he said. "Keep trusting them. Just do not stop trusting observation." Ethan nodded slowly. Ryan did too. As the sun settled lower behind the distant trees, Frank turned and began walking back toward the gate. Nobody tried to stop him. Nobody needed to. Some lessons arrived through instruction. Others arrived through example. Long after the field was cleared and the equipment packed away, the people who stood there that day remembered an old veteran who reminded them that experience is not the opposite of progress. It is the reason progress exists at all.